Illinois faces some big challenges. Today, we're about to hear a truly honest analysis of the problems we face. Equally as important, you'll also hear an in-depth discussion of some practical solutions. This is your radio source for stories, the insight, and the answers you won't hear anywhere else. Not in the media and not coming from Springfield. You're listening to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute. Now, here's your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Thanks for joining us on this edition of Illinois Rising. Dan Proft here, along with Jacob Hubert, senior attorney at the Liberty Justice Center. And Jacob, City of Chicago, seeing property taxes increase substantially, 20, 30, 40%, with more in the offing because, of course, of the unfunded pension liabilities and the bankrupt school system, and so on and so forth. And so you have people wanting to take advantage of the sharing economy by participating in services like Airbnb, where they can rent out their home and make a little bit of money and try and defray the costs of having to pay for their homes in Chicago now a third time because of their property tax burden. And of course, that looks like money to politicians. They want their piece of it. And so the city council, in their infinite wisdom, passed an ordinance imposing additional taxes on homeowners who participate in Airbnb, a 4% surcharge on short-term rentals, on top of Chicago's 17.4% hotel tax and other associated fees to dampen the enthusiasm for those who would like to participate in that sharing economy.
Yeah, and not just taxes, but also regulations, things they have to comply with, rules on whether they can or can't rent out that room in their homes. It's a huge ordinance that the city has passed on this, and not only does it cost you money in taxes, it costs you money in compliance, making it questionable whether this is going to even be worthwhile for a lot of people now.
The ordinance is 58 pages, more than 25,000 words, as you said, but of course the city council had to pass that ordinance to find out what was in it. For more on the ordinance from somebody who actually read it, which distinguishes him from the city council, we're now joined by George Sato, who is a Chicago-based attorney and has been looking at this matter with particular interest. George, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Dan.
And so, give us your interpretation of the ordinance and how it regulates what people do with their private property and their kind of ability to make it make sense to participate in the share economy through Airbnb and services like it.
Right. Well, we believe that, and I'm saying we in terms of Keep Chicago Livable, which is a nonprofit we formed very recently in response to this Airbnb ordinance. We believe that protecting there's a fundamental right that all property owners, all Chicagoans, all Americans have a fundamental property right to have guests inside their own home.
That's a revolutionary statement. That is an incredible statement. You are allowed to have guests in your home? Wow. All right.
And the city of Chicago is trying to regulate this. And in fact, this is not just a right. It's an ancient and sacred tradition. It's hospitality. It's the definition of it, of being able to have a guest inside your own home. And what the city of Chicago has done is that it's noticed this phenomenon of shared hosting sites like Airbnb, VRBO, where people are making money on it, and because they're able to set terms up front about what kind of compensation for hospitality they would like. And they're now painting it all with the same brush as people are running hotels. And I think Airbnb and these sites, they do blur the lines a little bit. But to say that everybody who has a guest in their own home, an invited guest, that they've vetted, and just because they have some terms that they agreed to up front, and because they met them on the internet, automatically is some business owner running a hotel, is I think a bridge too far and infringes on some very fundamental rights of our ability to pursue happiness as well as our freedom of association and speech.
Now, there's some people on the other side of this issue. The people who own hotels and motels, of course, don't like Airbnb and people renting out their rooms because they'd rather make them pay high rates to stay in their hotels. And the city likes it when people do that because they charge, of course, our city has a very high hotel tax. And so there's interest aligned against this. And opposing those kind of special interests is often difficult because, there's a few big hotel companies and there's just a lot of, people who want to rent out rooms in their homes. It's hard for them to get together and organize. But now your organization is going to be a voice for those people, it seems like. How did you decide that you were going to go about it that way? And how are you going to proceed with this group?
Well, this group was actually fairly organic. When the city of Chicago, when Mayor Rahm Emanuel announced that they were going to regulate Airbnb, I think a number of hosts were interested, concerned. I don't think hosts are object to the notion of some regulation, but we all wanted to see the details. And they seemed to be very short on the details, and there were some protests, and that's sort of where, which is sort of a remarkable thing in the middle of a day to have 200 people, outside of the City Hall Council room taking their lunch break, and then going back to their office is sort of a remarkable sight. So I met some people through that. I went to those, and then when they actually came out with the law, I read it and I was flabbergasted. This is a 58-page, over 25,000 word ordinance that is very difficult to understand. It's actually very poorly organized, regardless of the subject. You read this, and it's not organized in a way that I think a person of ordinary intelligence could understand. And even as an attorney, I was simply thinking, well, how can I help other hosts comply with this law? And as I read through it, I realized that it was almost impossible for me to understand it. I've been an attorney since 2002, real estate attorney. I think of myself as fairly sophisticated in legal matters, and yet I couldn't make heads or tails of this law.
And by comparison, the Chicago Ordinance governing hotels is 2 pages and 1,000 words.
Exactly, yeah, and that's sort of the rhetoric for the hotel industry is, we want to level the playing field. This is not a level playing field. I mean, Airbnb hosts are paying the same amount of the hotel operator tax as the hotels, and there's an additional 4% additional surcharge that the city of Chicago decided to impose, which arguably violates the home rule provision, the authority on the home rule authority, as well as uniformity provision in the Illinois Constitution. I mean, there are a lot of problems about how they did this. This is an income, earnings, or occupation tax, which the city of Chicago can't do without enabling legislation from the Illinois General Assembly. I haven't seen a state law that says they can do this.
Well, and
the hotel operator tax says 5%.
Yeah, and of course, the ordinance is meant to be unintelligible. I mean, that's the whole point. That's the law is unknowable, so you no longer have the rule of law. That's the story of the city of Chicago. But I wonder this too. But part of the ordinance, as I understand it, is essentially the city kind of de facto herding homeowners into neighborhood co-ops, like I think of Soviet-style agrarian co-ops, where you have to effectively share the number of days that you can rent out your home because there's limitations by block?
There are limitations based on the type of property you own, and whether you're a primary resident. So an example is, you could do everything you want to try to comply with this law, but if you live in a particular kind of building, a 2 to 4 dwelling unit building or a over 5 dwelling unit high rise, you could do everything you can to comply with this law. But because of something that your neighbor does, and it doesn't even have to be on the same site, it could be on HomeAway, FlipKey, VRBO, maybe you're on Airbnb, and something that there are max cap limits on the number of units,
right?
And so there are 6 units registered, and if a 7th person jumps on, apparently all 7 are illegal at that point, and all 7 are subject to $3,000 a day fines, if not more. That's extremely troubling to me. That's like if you parked on the street legally, and because somebody else parked somewhere else, all of a sudden both of you are getting $3,000 parking tickets. That seems crazy to me. And the city has even admitted they have no idea how this should be enforced. Here's the other thing that really should blow your hair back. So they have this very long, very confusing law, but there's a big loophole in it. And one of the biggest loopholes is that the commissioner can make an adjustment if there are certain dwelling caps, for instance. The commissioner can make an adjustment based on a number of very vague factors that they may consider, like the relevant geography, whatever that means. And the law says that the commissioner must solicit a recommendation from the local alderman.
Yeah, right. So this is protecting the feudal system and protecting their carve-out discretion, right? I mean, this is just like every other rent-seeking, inside dealing ordinance in the city of Chicago, and with the 50 feudal lords and the tiny dancer on top.
I've never seen a law that's drafted like this. It's almost they're admitting that this law is half-baked and they don't understand it. And so it's a check back with me. But it's not check back with the whole city council. It's check back with one alderman. Who, what's the separation of powers here? I mean, the legislators pass the law. Executive branch enforces the law. You don't check back with one legislator, say, is the law being applied correctly? I mean, that's a huge problem in terms of discriminatory enforcement, rent-seeking, pay to play. Friends of the alderman get to do it, but other people don't.
Oh, George, you and your antiquated notions of separation of powers and representative democracy. Come now. George Sato, he's a Chicago-based attorney. The organization Keep Chicago Livable, keepchicagolivable.com. George, thanks so much for joining us and educating us about this ordinance. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan.